really great to be back here in Greensboro. I've been here a couple times before, and each time I see the progress that's being made here, and it's impressive. That's all I can say. And I don't know if it's just by coincidence, but last week I was shopping for a ladder. I didn't find one, and here I am. So I might have to, bring extra baggage back home. I'm going to talk a little bit about how did we get the contemporary public art we have today. I actually have a script I'm going to read, but hopefully it won't feel like I'm just reading a script. It's not often that I actually get invited to a talk that I've given before, but the panel we did in Chicago back in June, I was told I had 15 or 20 minutes. And to give you the history of public art in America in 15 or 20 minutes it's not enough. But I'm going to leave it on this slide for a second and just talk about where are we? How did we get here? There's a cultural revolution, I believe, taking place in America as more and more artists have moved out of their studios and the confines of traditional venues and begin exploring new terrain. As founder of Forecast, a nonprofit public art organization in Minnesota back in 1978, and publisher of Public Art Review, which I did bring some copies with me today, and if any of you want, it's first come, first serve up here at the podium afterwards. I'm glad to share what I brought with me. But as publisher of this magazine for the past 26 years, I've seen a shift from art in public to art by, for, and about the public. Recent incarnations of public art, social practice, and placemaking movements have been informed by many decades of artists working in and with communities. In America, there are many important movements and trends worth recognizing that have influenced what's happening today. An important consideration is the type of culture that we have here in America. It's one that's grown from large influxes of immigrants over the past 300 years. Immigrants by nature are adventurers, risk-takers, innovators, inventors, makers, and doers. They invented our democracy, our way of government, and an American way of life. This history, I think, is reflected today in the trends visible in the public art field, including the bottom-up efforts by artists, communities, business, and philanthropy. The endowment here is a great example, as well as top-down initiatives, policies and programs that have been developed by federal, state, county, and city agencies. So if you think about it, there's this top-down effect of public art, and there's this bottom-up effect. And you're seeing a lot more of the bottom-up effect happening, especially in tough economies, where the governments are strapped and they're cutting back. Well, it hasn't stopped the grassroots efforts in public art from sprouting. So what is public art, of course? Comes up a lot, that question. And how has it changed in the U.S. over time? So when I think about public art, I don't think about it as an art form. Rather, it's a multifaceted field of inquiry. And it's really not unlike medicine or science, in which these areas are explored and experimented. It's an umbrella under which all kinds of creative practices are happening, and the public realm is explored. And this exploration and experimentation is going on all the time. And if we think we know the exact results we're going to get when we put ladders out there in the public realm, we don't. These are grand experiments, and if we're lucky, we tap into something like what happened here. And it's through trial and error and learning and building on what works and avoiding what doesn't work. And that's how you build a good public art program. That's how you build a good public art infrastructure and a public art ecology, which is what you have going on here. So here we are in Minnesota back in 1937, and I think about the artists who were pioneers back in the day, these visionaries who created places like Mount Rushmore and Paul Bunyan and Babe, the Blue Ox in Minnesota, and how it's holding up quite well today. These were efforts to attract tourists, and they were very effective in doing so. In thinking about a good starting point for the evolution of contemporary public art, however, I chose the WPA, the New Deal era that put artists to work in public works projects, sent artists out to record and share life in this country, and raise national awareness of real needs facing Americans following the Great Depression. I think the risk-taking WPA of the late 30s and 40s, thanks to President Franklin Roosevelt, was a watershed era that greatly influenced the rich, varied, and fast-evolving manifestations of public art we have today. And here's just one of hundreds of murals that were in post offices and public facilities around the country. This one in a post office in Iowa, as you can tell. And it's just an excellent mural, and it says a lot about Iowa, and it says a lot about patriotism that was going on at that time. And, you know, Mount Rushmore, how did that get there? Does anybody have a clue? It was actually created in response to marketing ideas. This 1941 masterpiece by Gutzon Borglum was triggered by someone seeking to market the Black Hills of South Dakota to tourists. What if we just carved that mountain and made big presidents there? That'll get the tourists to pull off the road, and that's exactly what happened. And in LA, Simon Rodea created the Watts Tower. He worked alone on this project in his backyard from 1921 to 1954. This solo effort stands today as a symbol of perseverance, ingenuity, and independence. What many of you may not know is after he felt like he was finished with the Watts Tower, which is now called, he just up and moved, disappeared. And his neighbors had to contend with this tower next door, what to do with it. And this is another aside, but you know, in the, I think it was the 70s or 80s, there was concern about this, you know, structure that maybe wasn't sound and maybe needed to be taken down because it wasn't safe. So the LA structural engineers decided to come out and do a stress test. And they got the cranes out with the stress test machines, and they couldn't budge it. So then the preservationists took over and restored it, and it's really something now. The area around it has been developed. This is the Wall of Respect mural in Chicago. It was really one of the first significant mural projects in the country to acknowledge the civil rights movement while it was underway. And it said Black Lives Matter in the 60s. This mural inspired countless community-minded artists and activists to use art to further just causes. Now, back in the late 50s, just to back up a little, Philadelphia was the first city in the country to start a Percent for Art program. And now there's something like 350 Percent for Art programs around the country where 1 or more percent of a city's capital budget is used to integrate public art into those public improvement projects. So that's now a common practice around the country and in different parts of the world. I grew up in St. Louis, and I'll admit it, I was in 3rd grade in 1963 when they were building the arch, which was finished in 65. So right now they're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the arch. And what most people don't know is there's a time capsule buried under one of the legs of the arch. And in 1963, all the 3rd graders in St. Louis, including me, were asked to write something down on a piece of paper about our city, and it's buried in that time capsule. So this must have influenced my career. All I can do. Now, don't ask me what I wrote, because I don't remember. But this was Eero Saarinen's masterpiece, and it was very controversial when it was proposed, and it was almost hard to believe it got built with all the controversy surrounding it. But now, new landscaping and revitalization of the gateway to the west, the museum that's underground there, is undergoing a transformation right now in honor of this 50th anniversary. In 1969, with the NEA's new Art in Public Places program, one of the big projects that was done was Alexander Calder's La Grande Vitesse in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Again, quite controversial at the time, and now people can't imagine this city without this icon. No more than St. Louis can imagine itself without the arch. So the NEA's Art in Public Places program launched in the 60s with this kind of project, and the CETA program of the 70s put many artists to work in communities as job training programs. So really it harkened back to the New Deal era when artists were put to work on public improvement projects and public works. And that's how I got my start in this field. I was gallery director for City Art Productions in Minneapolis, one of 60 artists hired through that program. They gave me a desk and a phone at the Arts Commission at the Minneapolis City Hall. And they said, Jack, there's only one catch. There is no gallery. They said, the city is your gallery, and your job is to organize exhibits by CETA artists at the library and the government center and the parks and the plazas. And here's your desk and your phone, now go for it. And I found that that was my calling, to be a connector, between the artists on one side with their talents and energies, and these public spaces, all of which come with different audiences and issues. And by playing that connecting role, it was not unlike computer dating. What kind of artists are interested in reaching what kinds of audiences, with what kinds of messages, and let's connect you two. And just doing that connecting led to all kinds of really exciting projects in Minneapolis back in the day, well before the city developed its first public art program. Today we have Our Town and Art Place and the Bloomberg Public Art Challenge, and they're really raising the bar. And we have your own endowment here. Raising the bar, the dialogue about artists and their role in city building and community revitalization, that's a top-down approach that's having a profound effect because it's encouraging communities to come up with ways they want to connect artists with community building. And for Forecast, we have the magazine. We also have a grant program for Minnesota artists. That started back in 1989. Instead of commissioning artists to do what we think they should do, we ask artists, here's a little bit of money, what would you like to do? Where would you like to take your creativity? What are issues you care about in your community? And here's some funding and technical assistance and documentation, and go do that. And use it as a career building project, something that will help you get from where you are now to where you want to be as a public artist, working outside of traditional venues. And of course, I was inspired by artists like Robert Smithson, who was working outside of the galleries and museum system. And in 1970, created Spiral Jetty in the Great Salt Lake. His simple, iconic land art gesture is a masterpiece, one that he never intended to be permanent, even though there have been folks like the Dia Foundation that have tried to restore the Spiral Jetty. But Smithson and other pioneers like Michael Heiser and James Turrell are really worth mentioning here because they set the stage for artists thinking big and bold and outside the box and looking at the world as a venue for creative expression. And they broke ground literally and figuratively. Alan Caprow is another pioneer, and in 1975 he did this Ecology. It was an upstream bucket brigade. So he got community members involved in this project, and he was one of the early originators with Klaus Oldenburg in happenings in all kinds of spaces. And this notion of living as art was a philosophy that he started and has been shared by many social practice artists today. Red Grooms was another hero of mine, and I got to see Ruckus Manhattan in New York back in 1975. This was a Creative Time project, a nonprofit group in New York, very adventurous. And he took over this space and created this caricature of Manhattan with all these environments you could walk through in a subway you could sit on, and it bounced up and down because it was mounted on car tires, and you walked in it and it had this bounce to it. So he had a knack for incorporating satire, theater, and comic strip aesthetics into some of the most fun public art of the past 50 years. Isamu Noguchi created this playground in Atlanta in 1976. Noguchi helped bring in an Eastern influence to public art and placemaking, and has influenced countless artists in the last 40 years. Of course, Christo and Jean-Claude, heroes of mine, and their running fence from 1976. They almost single-handedly reinvigorated the pioneering spirit in the field and demonstrated the power of self-funded independent work on a monumental scale. These are multi-million-dollar projects that they would do without any support from foundations or sponsors. They never accepted commissions. They only pursued projects they wanted to pursue, and they raised all their own money through the sale of drawings that Christo produced, renderings of the projects he wanted to produce, and he produced hundreds of drawings and renderings collected by museums and art collectors around the world raising millions of dollars for these projects, most of which only lasted like running fence for 2 weeks. And then all the materials were repurposed by the ranchers who loaned their properties for the installation. This is over 22 miles long through 2 counties in Northern California. Of course, you have your own pioneering artists right here. Hollis Simpson, and I'm sure inspired countless other artists who realized raw materials are around us all the time. And if we choose to look at them as materials to create something new and to inspire others, it's there for the taking. In fact, you're doing the landfill a favor by making art out of junk. And I think Hollis Simpson may have inspired Buster Simpson, who I know was here not too long ago. I don't think they're related. But Buster was part of a team in Seattle, where he lives, that created this Vuelen-Hoffman substation, a power station that was commissioned by Seattle Seattle City Light. And Seattle was pioneering in creating design teams and collaborations between artists and architects and landscape architects and engineers, and put Seattle on the public art map internationally. And of course, Richard Serra and Tilted Arc, 1981 till 1989, when it was forced to be removed through petitions that were signed because the public hated this piece for a number of reasons. But the forced removal of Serra's work made it clear that the public can have the final say about what kind of public art they want or not, no matter the stature of the artist. This was a great piece, I would argue, in the wrong site. It sits in storage somewhere, perhaps never to see the light of day. So the GSA, the General Service Administration, commissioned this for the Federal Plaza in New York. And when Serra lost the court case to keep this piece here, he at least retained copyright. They did not have the right to destroy it or to relocate it somewhere they thought it should go. So it's sitting in storage somewhere. And no history of contemporary public art would be complete without My Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial from 1982. This broke from the tradition. There was no statue. There was no flag. There was a gash in the landscape that allowed viewers to walk down a sloping path into its apex and view the thousands of names of those who died in Vietnam, to leave a remembrance or an artifact, and then walk back up a slope to re-enter the larger landscape. This was pioneering for a number of reasons, and memorial making has been changed ever since. But placemaking and public art are evident here. This is the second most popular memorial in the country, right after the Lincoln Memorial. 10,000 people a day on average visit this memorial. And the National Park Service has been challenged to find a warehouse to store all the artifacts that have been left, at the base of this memorial. And they're being preserved as well. So from Keith Haring in the 80s to Banksy invading New York last year, the hip-hop movement has had a profound impact on contemporary culture, from dance and music to street art, empowering younger generations of artists, many of them lacking formal art education, to express themselves in public. I would argue the graffiti and street art movement has had perhaps most profound influence on what's going on in public art today, internationally. And it's moved from the margins to the mainstream. You'll notice a lot of cities now, it's not about unwanted, illegal graffiti and how to remove it, but how to attract good graffiti artists to come and create works in our community so that we'll have the kind of impact that Wynwood District in Miami has experienced. The Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt started in 1987 and last displayed on the National Mall in DC in 1996, where, again, I was fortunate to witness. It featured more than 46,000 quilts, each made by hand by thousands of people around the country, honoring somebody who died from AIDS or complications of HIV. At the time, it was the largest community art project in the world. And I was told, when I was there for the 3 days it was installed, that there was an army of volunteers, 1,000 volunteers, that were ready and able and trained that if it started raining, that within 5 minutes it would all be under tarps and protected. And during the course of the 3 days, while there's thousands of people milling about and you can see the pathways they walk on, it's sort of like Woodstock on a grid. There are celebrities and major figures reading names over microphone 24 hours a day for the 3 days. Now, why would they do this? Why would they put this display on the National Mall in D.C.? Any thoughts? Why would they pick the National Mall? It's to reach the leaders of our country, to try and advocate for education and research about AIDS. So again, this was a socially minded public art project that had a message, and it was bringing it to where policymakers worked. And how do you have that effect? How do you get in the media every day? Revival Field by Mel Chin, which started in 1991 in St. Paul. While I was working for the city at the time as arts development manager, I got to meet Mel Chin and meet with the folks at the city and a curator from the Walker Art Center. He had gotten an NEA grant to create this project in a brownfield site, a polluted area of St. Paul. And it's one of the earliest eco-art projects that was designed to actually heal contaminated soil using hyperaccumulators. These are plants that have the unique ability to remove contaminants from the soil through their root system. When you harvest the plants, you've actually reduced the number of metals that have gotten into the soils underground. Well, it was also very controversial, and I don't know if all of you remember the big controversy with the NEA at the time, giving out grants for things that might not really be considered art, and this was one of them. But Mel Chin has definitely been grown his career and made a strong case for how artists working with scientists to address environmental problems can be a creative, innovative process and result in a creative product that also has artistic merit. And back in 1993, Project Row Houses in Houston, Texas, founded by artist Rick Lowe, was a series of shotgun houses in Houston that were facing demolition, and he helped convert them into artist residencies, community building project that's unparalleled. Rick Lowe just received the MacArthur Genius Grant last year for his work, and I think Project Row Houses was a big part of it. Through the efforts of a growing number of artists, disenfranchised people are being given voices unfiltered by the media. There's a growing participatory culture in America. It's not about buying or selling or authorship or star power. We all have an opportunity to co-create the kind of built environment and social realm we want to share. So from flash mob events to yarn bombing to new models of community engagement, people, artists and non-artists, are taking matters into their own hands. This is Water Fire in Providence, Rhode Island, started by artist Barnaby Evans, and it continues to today. It's a great example of what one artist can do to transform the way a city embraces the arts, revitalizes its downtown, and attracts global media attention. And Water Fire has been so successful in Providence that Barnaby Evans and the team have been invited to other cities, including Venice, to create Water Fire events there. And of course, Cloudgate, or as it's commonly referred to as the Bean, was Anish Kapoor's masterpiece as part of Millennium Park in 2006. Although Millennium Park opened in 2004, this piece was still shrouded in scaffolding because for the artist, it wasn't quite finished. It needed more polishing. So while the rest of Millennium Park was open, this sat in mystery under scaffolding. This project, along with Millennium Park, inspired dozens of other cities to build urban sculpture parks. Kapoor's genius here is the mystery inherent in the piece. And yes, it cost over $22 million to create, but that polish is part of the mystery inherent in the piece. It reflects and distorts and invites you to explore its surfaces. And once you're underneath this sculpture, to gaze up and lose yourself in the form. And I'd have to add Jaume Plens's Crown Fountain as another masterpiece that has turned Millennium Park into more than just a sculpture park, but a place that people gather, where they program free cultural events year-round. It isn't about just objects in a place. It's about programming a place and making it a place people own and feel proud. And if anybody ever invites you to Chicago, one of the first places they'll take you is Millennium Park. That's what you want, is that place that people have to bring you when you're the visitor. I should mention the economic impact has been huge. Highest property values in Chicago are right around Millennium Park. And Olafur Eliasson is another great artist who was brought to New York with the Public Art Fund and help from Mayor Bloomberg, who, as you know, recently just started the Bloomberg Public Art Challenge through his foundation. But he learned through projects like this and Christo's The Gates in Central Park that temporary public art on a certain scale can make a huge difference for developing a city. And the strategy behind having these incredible waterfalls in the East River, according to what I heard, was Bloomberg wanted to attract developers to the east side of Manhattan. And by putting these 5 waterfall sculptures in the East River and the water taxi tours, it got people to look at that part of Manhattan from the river that they just had not seen before. So it was clearly an economic development strategy, worth every penny, because now the east side of Manhattan is fully developed and is major attraction for people. But it was a temporary project, it was expensive, it was controversial, but if you were able to see it firsthand, any of you get to go to New York while this was going on? A couple? Well, you know what I'm saying, it was a draw. You couldn't help but have that included in your visit to New York. Do you have any art cars here in Greensboro? Well, we have an art car culture now in the Twin Cities. But really, the art car movement started back in Houston with a group called the Orange Show, and now there's parades and rallies all over the country. And this is Jan Elfman's ashtray car that was in the art car parade in Minneapolis a few years back. And this is Candy Chang, an artist from New Orleans who started this project, Before I Die, which is basically a kit you can order online in 40 different languages, and there's Before I Die murals all over the world now. But this is a brilliant concept that illustrates public art as a platform for the community's voice. It's a great example of participatory culture. And if you set up a Before I Die mural and put the chalk there and invite people to respond to this prompt, before I die, I want to, you fill in the blank. And within an hour, if there's a group of people, this will be filled up, and you'll see what your neighbors have in their bucket list. And it gets you to think about mortality, as it did for Candy Chang, who developed this. It was really after a friend of hers died, and she was really facing that notion. And how do you invite other people to have that experience too, and share it? And the social bonding that happens around something like this when people are sharing that can be very emotional, it can be very funny, it can be very poignant. Some of you may know about Parking Day, which was started by a group called Rebar in San Francisco, well over a decade ago, I think. And this simple project was conceived as a kind of public space hacking, an effort to liberate public space often reserved for cars, trucks, or buses. And now all over the world, I think in mid-September sometime, people use Parking Day as a project they do in their own community. Again, you can go online, learn how to start your own Parking Day, and take over a parking space for a day. And as long as you're plugging the meter, it's legal. And if you get thinking about, parking and parks and how can these spaces be used in other ways, you get artists and architects and community people thinking outside the box. What else could we do with this space? And if you've been to New York, the biggest tourist attraction now is the High Line. And this was a former elevated rail line through Lower West Side of Manhattan. It was initiated by community members to save the structure. It first opened in 2009 with James Corner Field Operation, Diller, Scofidio, Renfro, and P.A. Oldorf, with Creative Time as a partner again. This is one of the few fixed projects on the corridor. This is Spencer Finch's The River That Flows Both Ways. The Friends of the High Line have a full-time curator and sponsor rotating installations of temporary public art. I think this is public art in placemaking at its best. And now there are other cities looking at how to repurpose their rail corridors and other structures into linear parks that feature public art. Chicago just created the 606. I think it just opened a few months ago. And again, it's one of these ignored, leftover, elevated rail corridors. In the case of Chicago, it runs east-west through many neighborhoods, and there are tons of bridges that street traffic goes through, and now those are covered with murals. So it's really become this instigator of all kinds of community art. Jim Campbell is an incredible artist who uses interactive LED lights and computers to program these lights to do all kinds of amazing magic. And he's just one, I think, of a number of artists who are exploring new media and the technologies that we have today, which have really changed the way art is being made, the way audiences can access art, the way designers and fabricators and curators and public art program managers and archivists work. So now we have SketchUp and 3D printers and LEDs and Google Alerts and online archives and smartphone apps and much more to contend with. I think the internet itself has become a public space and the virtual has become a reality. And there are a lot of artists who are creating work specifically for online virtual experiences that can be accessed from computers anywhere in the world. If you think about that kind of access and how many people can experience your work online, you can imagine why artists are drawn to this medium and why it continues to innovate so quickly. And the interactivity of smartphones and locational devices that know where we are in the world, artists are finding ways to use that to create interactive experiences and public gaming projects that invite people to move around and do scavenger hunts. And well, you probably know about some of these yourselves. But now there's smartphone apps that help you learn about the public art on site where you are. So it's interpretive materials that you can take with you. You can get a video interview with the artist or the architect that designed the building or the artwork you're standing in front of, just like a museum guide, in the past few decades that have allowed people to wander the museums on their own. And in other cases now, QR codes that might be next to an artwork where you can just scan it and it brings up all kinds of information that otherwise we never would know about. What's the story behind the art? I'm really a firm believer that this technology is going to revolutionize education and appreciation of public art that wasn't possible before. Before you needed a tour guide to take you around and explain what is all this that's going on here. To be able to take that technology with you and for educators to use that and students to have access, it totally transforms the potential to share the stories and allow interactivity. You can leave your comments and leave your story about what you think and complete what I believe is the public art equation. We were talking about Burning Man last night and how a contingent of RVs from Greensboro ought to go to Burning Man next. But today we have Burning Man, which is in Black Rock City in Nevada, and it's just a one-week city that emerges on the desert, and 40,000 plus people migrate there and create incredible installations, which many are burned at the end, including a giant Burning Man. Likewise, New Orleans with Prospect One and Art Basel Miami and dozens of other urban sculpture parks and festivals and Nuit Blanche, all-night festivals are happening all over the country now. Again, these aren't so much top-down as bottom-up, these grassroots efforts. JR is a French artist, a photographer who's democratized photography and taking full advantage of Instagram and how everybody has a camera now, and how can we use photography to tell our stories and to share portraits. His global Inside Out project that was funded in part because he was a TED Prize winner a few years ago has invited hundreds of thousands of people to use photographic images to make statements in their own communities. Working globally has become the norm for some artists, like JR and Janet Eckelman, who's also a TED superstar. If you haven't seen JR's TED Talk, or Janet Eckelman's TED Talk, or even Candy Chang's TED Talk, I mean, they're really incredible orators and thinkers and speakers. Janet's Skies Painted with Unnumbered Sparks was installed temporarily at the TED Conference's 30th anniversary in Vancouver in 2014. It's her largest, most interactive project to date. It's 745 feet wide, 24 stories high. John Rubin and Don Waleski in Pittsburgh started the Conflict Kitchen back in 2010. This social engagement project takes the form of a real cafe, a diner that serves food only from countries the U.S. has a conflict with. What a brilliant idea. And we all know that food is a great equalizer. And we start eating food from different countries. What do you know about those countries? And their concept is to provide information about those countries on the back of the container they're wrapping your food to go in. Wonderful program, wonderful artists. So I'm going to wrap up soon here. This is Carl Walker's project from 2014, last year. The short title is A Subtlety. It was at the Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn, again, organized by Creative Time. It was Carl Walker's first major public art project, and it clearly did not play it safe. This deceptively complex project features risque subject matter. It's a commentary on black creativity and white voyeurism. And in one interview, Walker said, and I quote, "How do people look? How are people supposed to look? Are white audiences looking at it in the right way? And are black audiences looking to see this piece? And of course, my question is, what is the right way to look at a piece that is full of ambiguities and ego and all the other things that go into making a monumental sculpture?" This was public art that people had to seek out. It wasn't a piece that people bumped into on their way to work. And in this way, it became an attraction, it created a buzz, and it stirred the pot quite a bit, something all good art should do. I wanted to show this graphic to help reinforce the fact that today there really are multiple types of public art forms being practiced today. And this list is by no means comprehensive. And of course, a slideshow can't convey the kinetic nature of a Hollis Simpson piece or the sound of certain sculptures. Public art is really an experience, and artists are in the experience business. And when you start to see this, you get the sense that there's a lot of interactivity and collaboration inherent in this field. For me, the practice is closer to theater than it is the traditional notion of visual art, where the artist is working in solitude in their studio, and the works show up in a museum where it's don't touch and be quiet. You know, this is more dynamic and interactive and in your face. And when it's on the street, you know, people are going to touch the work. They're going to climb on the work. They're going to prompt conversations, and they won't be quiet ones. And so when you think about theater as a collaboration and how different people come together to make something happen, I think that's really the analogy that fits public art. You're coming together to make public art happen here in Greensboro. It's a collaboration. And people play to each other's strengths. So there's the director and the actor and the lighting designer and the backstage managers. You know, like George. George is a backstage manager making stuff happen here elsewhere. And that's what I do, you know. I'm not out front and center. That's the artist and their work. But if not for the army of people backstage who are making things happen, we wouldn't have this great public art that we have today. Today we have biennales and Nuit Blanche festivals and urban art parks and artists in residence. There's a public art network. There's an international public art film festival. There's even an international award for public art. I'm glad to say Forecast, my organization, partnered with Shanghai University 4 years ago and started this International Public Art Award program. There have been 2 since we started. The last award ceremony took place in Auckland, New Zealand in July. And all the data collected about these projects around the world are going to be shared for free online. We're collaborating with the Public Art Archive, another online resource for public art, to upload all of that content so people can have access to the stories of public art going on in other parts of the world. I'm a firm believer in the value of telling the story and sharing what other people are doing so that others who are just getting started in this field, artists, consultants, curators, funders, have something to look at. What else has been done? What can we learn? We don't have to start from scratch. We still face plenty of challenges. We lack a shared vocabulary. The educational system we have around public art is inadequate. We're stuck with some outmoded policies. Most people engaged in the field today lack the historical context, training, and theoretical underpinnings. I think there's a divide between the top-down and the bottom-up approaches, and if that keeps widening, we'll have more issues. My goal and my advice is try and find a connection between the top-down and the bottom-up. Most public art programs in this country are limited to commissioning fixed art. That means their money is coming from capital budgets and are restricted how they can be used. They have to be for bricks and mortar building of something that later needs long-term care and maintenance. And oftentimes the programs that are commissioning art don't have the resources to take care of the art that they're commissioning. And what happens in 10 or 20 years is what was once a major asset becomes a liability. And I would say most cities are resistant to change. And this is something that, whether we like it or not, with artists showing us the range of possibilities, the programs that have been institutionalized around the country are going to be forced to be changed. Because they're going to look around and see what other cities are doing, saying, why aren't we innovating like they are? Why aren't we following Greensboro's lead? We can have the private sector and the public sector contributing the kind of art that we want and need in our community. But I would argue, and I want to point out, that most cities in America are investing in public art of one kind or another, and many of them, even some of the smallest cities, are supporting public art and aren't even aware of it. They're funding fireworks. And fireworks are public art too. And I would argue, if they're not public art, what are they? If finely crafted pyrotechnic displays attracting thousands to gather and gaze collectively in wonder isn't public art, what is it? And I like to end my slideshows with a bang.